Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. We're all still here, hopefully, and feeling well. The Roaring Twenties is going to be our topic for today, and what we're going to discuss a couple things. First of all, we're going to talk about the legacy of World War One here in the United States. Um, we're going to talk about a growing struggle between sort of a change to a more modern world from a more traditional world. We're going to see some shifts in things like that, and then we're going to talk about the getting set up for the Great Depression. What things helped lead into that? So that's going to be our topic for today. So where I think we'll start is with the legacies of World War One and exactly what happened here in America, sort of back home, as a result of the war here at the U.S. Now remember that the United States got off fairly easily in terms of loss of life during the war. In fact, we lost more people to a flu epidemic than we did to the war. But that doesn't mean that we got away scot-free and unaffected. One of the things that's going to happen is you're going to see an increase in race problems in America. Uh, Partly this is because of a phenomenon known as the Great Migration. During the war, and really a few years before and during, but during the war, uh, quite a few African Americans moved from the rural South to the North, about 6 million of them. And of course, when you see a huge migration of people like that, well, what that's going to cause is displacement of other people. Okay. This is just like the waves of immigrants in prior decades, where they come in and the people who are already there, who are established, look at these newcomers as a threat because they are a threat. They're competition for jobs and housing and all of those things, that there's already not enough good jobs and good housing to go around. So now here's a whole nother group of people. And remember, we're very good at playing us and them as human beings. We're superlative at that. And it becomes a matter of us and them. And what that's going to lead to, unfortunately, is race riots across the country. In 1919, they had race riots in many cities, both north and south. Uh, Again, a lot of it having to do with competition for jobs and housing, but it's going to end up with hundreds of people being killed, mostly blacks, dying in September of 1919 as a result of these terrible race riots. In the South, you're going to see an increase in lynchings. Part of this is also a response to the fact that quite a few African Americans, as a matter of fact, more than their population in the United States, a higher percentage than their overall percentage of the population, served in the military during the war. Partly that's because poor people are more likely to be drafted than wealthy people. It's just the way that the laws were worked. But a lot of it had to do with volunteering. And a lot of African American young men chose to prove their loyalty and prove their worth and things in their own eyes and in the eyes of society at large by enlisting and serving in the military. Now, many of them never ever saw combat. Most of the segregated black units, and remember at this point, all the units are segregated, most of the black units were kept on non combat duties. They did support roles, which actually ended up keeping more of them alive, but it also was somewhat degrading. But they were trained and equipped, and they did go over and fight in the war. And when they came home, many of them were not ready to just go back to being sort of a second class citizen when they had proven themselves as good Americans. So World War One had actually been fairly good for the unions and the labor movement, and partly that's because the leader of the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers, who we've talked about before, agreed to suspend strikes by their members for the duration of the war. In return, the National War Labor Board legally required management of companies to negotiate with workers. So they sort of stepped in whenever there was a threat of a strike. The AFL is going to grow by a third during World War I. Lots of people joined it. The war economy brought higher pay, lots of business, lots of jobs as people are trying to produce goods for the army and better conditions. When the war ends, however, the companies try to roll things back. And as a result of that, 1 in 5 workers, 20% of the entire workforce, is going to go on strike during 1919 to keep these conditions. Most of the strikes are going to fail because the government was opposed to them. They claimed that it was merely a matter of communist plotters getting into the unions and stirring up trouble. Not just private workers wanted to have unions, public workers did as well. The Boston Police Department went on strike in 1919 in order to get better pay and conditions. And the governor of Massachusetts at the time was a man named Calvin Coolidge. You'll see his name again later when he becomes president. He got a lot of support popularly all around the country when he basically said, work or be fired. And when they didn't return to work, he fired everybody that had not and just replaced them. So he took a hard stand against them, and he played it off as a hard stand against communism and socialism and anarchy. Some companies, however, because there was an economic boom going on through the 20s, through most of the 20s, it seemed like the economy was just going nuts, just great. And so they practiced something known as welfare capitalism. And what that means is that rather than risk strikes and things, but not wanting to get tied into to contracts with labor unions, Ford and people like him offered the workers certain incentives to keep them happy. Reduced hours, but decent pay, not much necessarily better, but good pay. He brought in dentists. He created daycare centers. He brought in doctors. If you were ill, you could go to an infirmary at the plant and things like that. And you didn't have to pay for it. I mean, it was just, you just went over there and they took care of you. And the idea was to keep your workers happy and healthy. They don't go on strike. They work better with good morale and good health. And without having to tie all of these into a contract. The reason they could afford these things is because of the booming economy. They had a lot of money coming in, so they could afford these expenses. By not signing contracts, however, when you see the economy start to slow down, when you see problems start to happen and sales begin to slow and the money supply starts to trickle off, then Ford and the people like him would and could reduce those benefits and help to keep it more affordable to operate their plants. Now, the Bolshevik Revolution and ongoing Russian Civil War over in Russia that started during the Great War has scared a lot of Americans. There's a lot of turmoil and unrest. They hear horrible stories coming out of Russia, many of which were true. It was an ugly thing. And there's an organization that the Bolsheviks create. The Bolsheviks are the communist revolutionaries, by the way, in Russia. So the Bolsheviks, they create an organization known as Comintern, which is an abbreviation of Communism International. And this was an organization dedicated to an international communist revolution. And they're not shy about explaining that this thing exists and that what it's for and everything. And that makes us even more nervous because basically what they're saying is our plan is to eventually spread across the world to make everybody communists. Well, we didn't want that. Um, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer sets off the first real persecution of communists in America in the 1920s. Someone attempts to blow him up. He was the Attorney General of the United States, so he's a sort of a big public figure. And so they try to blow him up, and a bomb explodes at his house, misses him, doesn't kill anyone. Thankfully, it didn't hurt his family or him. But it causes him to crack down on radical organizations. And it got to the point that people thought that he'd gone way too far, that he had slipped around the bend. And so they have what are called the Palmer raids, and they arrest over 6,000 people. A lot of the legalities are rather dubious as far as did they have probable cause or a proper search warrant or any of those sorts of things when they went in busting into people's homes and such. And the answer is actually no. One of the crimes that is persecuted at this time was they're not even really communists; they're actually anarchists. A couple of Italians who are accused of murder were arrested in 1921. There's some evidence that they did it, but there's evidence that maybe they didn't. It is pretty much certain that they got railroaded at the trial. And so they're eventually sentenced to death in 1927. They were executed. Their names are Sacco and Vanzetti. And they become, excuse me, they become martyrs for the socialist and anarchist crowds. And so here is a political cartoon showing Attorney General Palmer going out for a walk. And you see behind him where he can't see, everything's sort of normal. You know, there's just people walking down the street, kids playing, yada, yada, yada. In front of him where he sees everything, everybody is a wild-eyed, bearded, radical anarchist carrying a bomb. They're all reds. And so that's what he's seeing. Is he saw them everywhere in a threat in everything. And this is Sacco and Vanzetti. These are the men that were accused of murdering two men during a botched robbery at a factory at which one of them worked. A lot of people thought that their entire conviction and trial was all politically motivated because they were anarchists who were linked to socialists as well. So as part of this Red Scare, they think that they were sort of executed as an encouragement to others to back off this whole anarchy, socialist, communist thing. And so after 6 years of appeals and a lot of public support, I mean, there were some fairly famous people who supported them and everything, they were in fact executed. So politics in the 1920s are um, dominated by the idea of a return to normalcy. Basically, World War I is going to be the end of the progressive movement for quite a while. And that's because people blame Wilson, who was a progressive, for the war. And they say that all of these progressive ideals are what got us involved in the war. We should have stayed the way we always have been, and it would have saved 100,000 American lives, and so on and so on. And so the dominant political theme of the Roaring Twenties is to sort of roll back things and kind of go back to the old way of doing things. We're going to limit the government. The progressive era had expanded the government quite a bit. Now we're talking about limiting it. We're not going to let the government grow and expand nearly as much. And isolationism, that's the other one. And the key factor in that was our rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, especially the part where it mentioned us joining the League of Nations. So although the League of Nations was proposed by an American president, The treaty that would have brought us into it was rejected by the U.S. Senate. And so we never sign that treaty. The United States never becomes legally committed to the Treaty of Versailles. It will be a different treaty, the Treaty of Berlin 1921, that ends the war between the United States and Germany. So we reject Wilson's progressivism and elect an old guard Republican named Warren G. Harding in 1920. Now, Wilson's not running. He's ill, and basically he's had a stroke, and he's just done. So James Cox is going to be the Democratic candidate who runs against Harding, and he loses pretty badly, 404 to 127. Interesting fellow that is Cox's running mate for vice president is a man by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and we'll hear about him again later. He will come back. Cox had run on a platform including participation in the League of Nations, and again, this was an unpopular idea. People were looking back to Washington's old farewell address where he said, "Don't get entangled in the affairs of other nations," and they're thinking, we did a lot better back when we did that, so we should still do that. We should go back to that. And so we return to an isolationist nation, and we'll stay that way really until the early 1940s. Something else that's happening in the political arena for the first time in the 1920s era is that women have joined it. And that's because the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. The 19th Amendment says that no one may be denied the right to vote because of their sex or gender. In other words, you can't tell a woman she can't vote because she's a woman. If there's another reason why she couldn't vote, you could deny her, but that's no longer a legitimate reason to do so. What happens as a result of that? Well, we start to see some legislation that is specifically aimed at helping women. What a shock. The first and most important of them is the Shepard-Towner Federal Maternity and Infancy Act. And what this did was it provided federal aid to federal funds for education programs and health clinics. And it's going to help improve health care for the poor, especially for expecting mothers and their young children. And for the first time, this is going to be how it works, is that Congress allots money to the states, and then the states actually use that money to carry out this social welfare program. That is a method that is going to be reused during the 1930s, and really we still use it today. The food stamp program is a good example of that. The federal government provides the state of Texas with a certain amount of funds, and the state of Texas divides that out and places a certain amount on each individual person's account. And then you use a little card and everything. It used to be actual food stamps, like actual, wasn't like a stamp. It was like a funny looking dollar bill, but it used to be actually a paper bill thing. But anyway, but this particular one, the Maternity and Infancy Act, it was pushed for by women because these were things that they were concerned about. They want to lower the infant mortality rate. That's the main thing. Another thing that is going to be proposed, it doesn't really get a lot of traction, a lot of push until 50 years later, but it's an equal rights amendment. It's an amendment to the Constitution that says that not only can women vote, but they have all of the legal rights that men do, that they cannot be treated differently under the law. And that is not going to pass. So what did Mr. Harding do as president? Well, one of the things he does is he puts Herbert Hoover in charge of commerce. He makes him Secretary of Commerce. That's the department responsible for things like making sure that everybody's using the same weights and measures and stuff like that. That's for basically trade purposes, internally and externally. He wanted to create a concept known as the associated state. That's where governments and business leaders work together to achieve a level of economic stability. It does stifle competition, however. That is a competition stifler. He does have a fairly major scandal during his presidency. It's called the Teapot Dome scandal, where his Secretary of the Interior, a fellow by the name of Albert Fall, is making land leases on government land to oil companies. And that's fine. That's perfectly legal. That's part of what his job is to do, is to determine where they can have oil leases on government property. And so he does so in certain national parks and preserves where they believe that there is oil. And there was. But he allows them to do this, not because it's going to be beneficial to anyone or anything. No. He does it because they bribe him. And he gets caught. So it's big scandal, huge scandal. One of the better things that he does while he's president is that he gets the people together, the nations together, for the Washington Naval Conference. And basically what he's doing is he's pushing to limit and or eliminate large portions of the fleets of different nations around the world, in particular 5 countries: the British, the United States, France, Italy, and Japan. And these are the 5 largest navies in the world. And how they do that is that they come up with a ratio of tonnage. Ships are measured, one of the ways ships are measured in size, by their displacement weight, the weight of the water that they, when you put them in the water, when you put the ship in the water, how much the weight of the water that it pushes out of the way is, would weigh. Okay, so that's called its displacement tonnage. And so they came up with a naval treaty which says that the United States and the United Kingdom can have 5 tons for every 3 tons that the Japanese have, for every 1.75 tons that the French and the Italians have. But nobody can have more than the ratio. Japan, of course, needs a strong navy because they're an island nation. Same with the UK. The United States needs one because we have 2 coasts to watch. We have 2 to patrol. And so that's why we have such a large one. It's not popular in Japan, to say the least, but everybody else feels pretty good about it. Then Harding is going to go on a trip to San Francisco. He's going around the country just sort of seeing what's really going on. And while he's in San Francisco, he has a cerebral hemorrhage and suddenly dies on August 2nd of 1923. So with Harding dead, the vice president becomes president of the United States. And the vice president at the time is Calvin Coolidge, the same Massachusetts governor who had fired half the Boston Police Department. Coolidge was actually famous for something very rare amongst politicians. He was famous for not talking. One of the newspapermen back in the day wrote that Coolidge spoke as if his speech were paid like a Western Union telegram, that is, by the word. And so he never used 2 words when one would suffice. Always, always, always very taciturn, very, very quiet man, as far as that's concerned. And so he gets nicknamed Silent Cow. He was an old guard Republican. He was anti-taxation. He and his Treasury Secretary, a fellow by the name of Andrew Mellon, advocated tax cuts for the wealthiest. Income tax percentages will drop the most on the wealthy, but drop some on the poor and the middle class. And at the same time, tax revenues increased dramatically. Okay, so he reduced the rate, but the total amount of money that they made went up. How is that possible? Well, if you get 30% of $10, you got $3. If you get 10% of $100, you get $10. So that's how it works. If you have a much bigger pool, then the percentage, although lower, becomes more in absolute terms. Okay. He advocated civil rights for minorities as a constitutional requirement. He says, 14th Amendment says you got to treat everybody the same. We don't do that. He pushed unsuccessfully for federal anti-lynching laws as a result, and he granted citizenship to the Indians living on reservations. Finally, they're recognized as U.S. citizens in 1924. 1920, not even 100 years have Native Americans been considered, legally speaking, Americans. Coolidge will be reelected in 1924. He wins all but the Solid South, which votes strictly Democrat. This quote from Calvin Coolidge does a wonderful job of summing up exactly how he felt about taxes. Another cornerstone of American foreign policy, which had begun back in the Taft administration, back before Wilson, is an idea known as dollar diplomacy. And what this meant was that the U.S. government would give incentives to banks to provide loans to foreign countries. That debt then ties those governments to U.S. interests. And if they stop paying those loans, then the U.S. government, as guarantor, would step in and try to basically force them to do so. And as a result, we are going to interfere in the money situation of many Latin American countries over the 20 or so years of this time period. It is a part of why, although many people from Latin America, Central America, like Americans, like us as individuals, they're not terribly fond of our society. We have been both a military and a monetary bully at times to the other countries of the Central America. Yet another issue that is going on, and it's somewhat political in that it involves legalities and laws and things, is a struggle over the morals of the United States, morality and such. And that shows up in two places. One is prohibition. Prohibition is going to be the law through basically through the 1920s. The 18th Amendment was passed during World War I, partially in response to anti-German sentiments, as a way of punishing German Americans without really doing anything harsh to them, by basically saying, well, that they're not going to get to have any beer. And prohibition prohibits the sale, manufacture, transportation, and importation of alcohol. It does not technically illegal possession, ownership, or consumption of alcohol. It just says that you cannot legally do any of the others. The idea was that once people drank up what they had, it would all be gone. The law was often broken by hidden bars called speakeasies, and some of them were very ingeniously hidden. My personal favorite is that there was one that was in a sort of a back area, sharing a wall with a mortician, someone who embalms the dead, right? And so they had these coffins propped up against the wall as display models, displays of the various kinds of coffins one could get in order to be buried in it, right? And so what they did was they put one of them right up against the wall, and they put a door in the back of it. And so you would open up one side of the coffin, close it, an interior little peephole would open, and they would ask you to identify yourself, basically give a password essentially, and then they would open up the inside door, and so you could pass through into the bar afterwards, which is just morbidly ingenious and a lot of very interesting sort of thing. Prohibition has one serious, I mean, besides the fact that it simply didn't work, it has another major drawback, and an totally unintended consequence is that it helped to propel organized crime in America as a result of prohibition. These the sneaking in booze and things took organization. It was not easy to do, just one or two guys. And so organized crime took it over. This would be the mafia. Okay. Uh, they would smuggle booze in from Canada or Mexico or just directly over from Europe and made a huge amount of money selling it. And so there's tons of money involved in it, and the gangs get involved in it and turn it into a very profitable, um, a big profit center for them. Another issue, oh, it's also going to be the only amendment that's ever been repealed. And of course, that took another constitutional amendment. The 21st Amendment, passed in the early 1930s, will repeal the 18th Amendment. So it's about a 13-year span that prohibition was a thing here in the United States. The other issue, or another issue at the time, was uh, the question of evolution. And what we get is the so-called Scopes monkey trial. John T. Scopes was a teacher, a science teacher in Tennessee, and he intentionally, knowingly, and willingly broke the law. The law in Tennessee said that you could not teach evolution to students, and Scopes responded with, well, how can you deny things that are physically true? We know this is true. We have plenty of evidence. And so he was put on trial. Now, the question is not whether or not he broke the law. He admitted he had done that. The question really is, should he be punished for it, and how should he be punished for it? And because it's the first case of its kind, it got lots of newspaper coverage. Lots and lots of reporters in town, made the small town turn into a big town virtually overnight. A lot of money being thrown around, people in the hotels, people eating out, and all that. They really, it really added up. Anyway, so the trial will go on for 2 weeks in the town of Dayton, Tennessee, in the summer of 1925. Intense publicity and news coverage. It's in all the papers. Basically, what we're talking about is a conflict between modern science and religious fundamentalism. Scopes was supported by the ACLU and had Clarence Darrow, a famous attorney, working for him. The prosecution worked under the leadership of William Jennings Bryan, the same fellow who's run for president a few times and lost, but great orator, good at the law, not superb. And what's going to end up happening is that Scopes is going to lose. Now, what's all the hubbub? He only gets fined. Okay, he gets fined, I want to say something like $15, which was, a piece of money back then, but nothing like, it was like a couple of $100. It was not a huge amount. But on the principle of it, he had stood up to it. He had stood up against the law on the principle of it. And like I said, really nobody ever denied that he had done it. They just sort of denied whether or not he should be punished for it. Have a few good political cartoons relating to the Scopes monkey trial. Here we have Scopes being portrayed as a Pied Piper. If you know the story of the Pied Piper, he played his pipe and all the rats followed him. Well, in this case, he's playing the pipe and all the children are following him. And the tune he's playing is the hypothesis of evolution, leading towards disbelief in the God of the Bible by going down the path of education and everything. So, as usual, very subtle message being given off here. And here's another one with a fundamentalist dragging the younger generation through superstition and muck. And the last couple I'm going to show you for Scopes. Here we have P.T. Barnum of Barnum and Bailey Circus. Hopefully, well, if you saw The Greatest Show on Earth, that's who the character is. Anyway, he's complaining because nobody's paying attention to his show. They're all watching the courthouse show of the evolution trial. And then the other is about sort of making fun of the town of Dayton, Tennessee, for making all of this money off of the Scopes case. And people throwing money their way because of the publicity and things. I mean, all of the hotels around town were booked full. All of the restaurants were very busy, and so the town itself actually got a prosperous belt out of this 2 week long case. The last thing we want to talk about culturally is the resurgence of, unfortunately, the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Klan had been destroyed back in the 1800s by President Grant, who had used the military to crush them. Birth of a Nation, film by D.W. Griffith, and it's considered a classic of film, not because of its subject matter, but for technical merits. It helped to rebirth the Klan, and it basically glorified the Klan and whitewashed their entire history, making it seem as if they were, heroes of a lost cause, et cetera, rather than despicable, racist pieces of junk. And so it helped the Klan to come back in the 1920s. But this is not the same as the old Klan. This Klan is not just anti-African American. It's not just anti-freed slave. Now it's basically anybody who's not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So Catholics don't like them. Jews don't like them. Italians don't like them. African Americans still don't like them either. But any immigrant group, any of the people that basically white Anglo-Saxon types, that would be British English type descent, English, Scots, Welsh, that sort of thing. Anybody that wasn't that and Protestant was fair game. They just felt very strongly that they were being threatened by all of these things. And of course, when people get scared, they react with anger and often violence. You would think that the Klan would be strongest in the South, but strangely enough, it's actually going to be the state of Indiana up in the north that will have the most members. Again, it's not entirely just about race. It's about fear of people who aren't like us. And again, it's an us and them thing. People who ain't like us, and they're threatening our way of life, our means to support our families, and our ability to live in the neighborhoods we want to live in, and so on and so on. And so it turns out that the largest concentration of them will be in Indiana. The election of 1928 rolls around. Democrats are going to nominate the governor of New York, a fellow by the name of Al Smith. He is the very first Catholic candidate to run for the presidency. Southern Protestants, however, refused to vote for him. This breaks the solid South because he doesn't get those Democrat votes in the South because he's Catholic. Republicans nominate Herbert Hoover, who had been the Secretary of Commerce under Harding and who had before that been in charge of war industries during World War I and had done a good job of that. He was very popular with those old guard Republicans, and so he's going to get elected in 1928, take office. Wins pretty easily. In the wake of the Great Migration, you see new African American neighborhoods become a thing in the North. And the population of the Harlem district of New York City will triple as a result of the Great Migration. And because they've got an opportunity to be educated and things, you see an era of an artistic movement known as the Harlem Renaissance. Well, it's not just arts; it's about social issues and the culture and everything. But it's an idea that they express pride in being black, and that's a new idea in those days. Okay, this is the where they start the whole concept of black is beautiful and everything. It's actually a misquote of a poem by Langston Hughes. Here's Mr. Hughes here on his picture. He was a poet writing from Harlem, and he wrote, "I am a Negro and beautiful." Um, and Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote books focusing on the impact of white oppression on blacks, both adults and children, and just how it had sort of gotten into the people's psychology. One thing that's going to help drive this movement is jazz music, which actually began in New Orleans. Jazz is an American art form. It's really one of the only truly purely American-born art forms. It starts in New Orleans and spreads northward. Here you have a fellow by the name of Louis Armstrong up there on the top photo, who helped spread jazz when he moves to Chicago from New Orleans. And he was a trumpet player, very famous, excellent player, and the sort of upbeat, high tempo music perfectly suited the attitude of the 1920s. And so jazz is really the soundtrack of the 1920s. It's just, I mean, sometimes it's even known as the jazz age. It's all about, let's not think about those dark days of the war. Let's be high energy and positive and enjoying our lives. And that's kind of what it did. It was a break from the old style. It was new, it was modern, it was cool, it was current, and it was incredibly popular. Um, Fella in the picture below, this man is Mr. Marcus Garvey. He was a Jamaican immigrant to the United States, and he created, as part of the Harlem Renaissance, the United Negro Improvement Association. And unlike the NAACP, uh, the UNIA actually advocated black separatism, an idea that would be resurgent during the 1960s civil rights era. But Mr. Garvey said that basically African Americans were never going to get a fair shake in the United States, as evidenced by the rise of the Klan again and things like that. And he said basically African Americans should return to Africa. Argued all the time with W.B. Du Bois over at the NAACP, who had very strong beliefs the other way, that African Americans should remain in America and prove themselves to be just as good as anybody else. In other words, white people. And so anyway, so they conflicted a lot. And so as part of this Back to Africa movement, Garvey actually uh, created a passenger ship company and called Black Star Lines, which is a takeoff of White Star Lines, which was a famous ocean cruise passenger company. They had owned the Titanic, for example. Anyway, and so he solicited contributions through the mail, and the company collapsed. And Garvey is going to be convicted of mail fraud and deported. Now, was he really defrauding people? That's hard to say. There's some people believe that yes, he was absolutely doing this as a scam. There are some people who say, well, he just really didn't know what he was getting into and what he was doing, and so all of the money that he was getting sent to him to help support this cause, he used some of it to live on and things, and that's okay. That's part of what happens with donation money. A lot of times, is it gets used by the people that to whom you're actually donating, uh, for when they have to have money. And they others will say that he just was a bad businessman and really bit off more than he could chew, and the company failed, and that he was really being prosecuted for political reasons, not really for being an honest, being truly a criminal. Um, Garvey also supported a concept of Pan-Africanism, in which he hoped to unite all individuals of African descent from everywhere, including Africa, and that they would all, kind of come together and pull together for a common purpose, which is sort of naive, ignoring a lot of history over in Africa. So while in one way things seem to be going very good in America, um, the economy was just booming and things. We had won World War One. While a lot of things, it seemed like in America was modernizing. They were cities were becoming electrified, and they were building new bridges, and just all of this stuff was going on. There's a lot of people who still really aren't happy with how America is or where it's going, and these disillusioned authors um, criticize the increasing consumerism and materialism of American culture, and they get known as the lost generation. Many of them had fought in the Great War and were disillusioned because of that. Others had just been told the stories and things of it. There were a lot of reasons why people were members of the lost generation. Many of them were expatriates. Many of them actually left the United States, went overseas, and lived overseas. Paris was a very popular spot, among others. But there's several examples of their literature given here. Probably the one that most of y'all would be familiar with is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, a book that I personally find a bit dull, but that's me. It does have a lot to say about discontent amongst people in the 1920s and how wealth doesn't make you happy, even though everybody assumed that it would. So, like I mentioned, the economy is kind of going to really take off in the 20s. Right after the war, things kind of recede a little bit. There's a bit of a recession right after the war because of inflation and the unemployment of all of the soldiers coming back. But in the 1920s, government tariff and tax policies were very friendly to business. Calvin Coolidge, who was president during most of the 20s, um, or during a big chunk of the 20s, said that the business of America is business. And he and his old guard Republican buddies, who have been in charge the entire decade of the 1920s. Okay, in 1920, Harding got elected. He became president. Old guard Republican. He dies. Coolidge takes over. Coolidge runs again in 24 and stays president until 28. Then Hoover runs. Hoover wins. All of these guys, old guard Republicans. And so for 12 years, the United States is run by old guard Republicans, and the economy is doing well. Excuse me. Farmers, however, had been left out of a lot of the economic prosperity of the 1920s. They had had a good time during the war. Farm prices had been up. There was a lack of supply, particularly in Europe, because of so many people off fighting the war rather than farming. Now the survivors of the war are back at work on their farms and things. So there's renewed competition, and it drives the price of crops down. A lot of farmers had borrowed money using their land as collateral in order to purchase equipment to use to grow more crops during the boom. Um, and so what ends up happening is that farmers begin to produce more and more in the hopes of making more money. So the idea is if the price of, say, a bushel of corn has been cut in half, if I want to keep living the way I've been living, I've got to raise twice as much corn. Okay. which makes sense, except that what happens is, oh, everybody's doing that. There's twice as much corn in the supply. There's no more demand. The price of corn is going to drop. And so they kept pushing their own farm prices down and down and down. Overproduction was a serious issue, and it became worse as the decade continued. And here's a chart of the gross national product per capita from 1919 to 1930. So basically covering the 1920s. And you can see that recession there where the GNP drops between 1919 and 1921. But from that point until 1929, it's a pretty steady growth uh, stretch, especially 22 to 23. That's a huge jump there. And gross national product is essentially how much is created, how much wealth is created per person uh, in the country. Something else that's been changing, and this has been coming as time goes on. We talked about it becoming more and more consumerist and more materialistic during the Gilded Age. Well, things are getting even worse. In order to keep selling goods, you start to see more and more people purchasing items on credit. And there's all kinds of new consumer products that make your life easier. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, dishwashers, refrigerators, electric sewing machines, everything. The advertising industry changes how they sell things. They used to sell items prior to this based on really just a recitation of these are the things that our product will do for you. You know, it will clean your clothes and it will be great and they'll smell good and be clean. That's what our product does. Buy our product. Now it becomes more of a, you know, if Bob would wash his clothes in Jiffy Clean uh, detergents, then he'd smell so fresh that I'm sure that pretty little girl Jill will notice him and maybe marry him. I mean, the whole idea of, I mean, that's ridiculous, right? But it begins to become a way of selling things, is that they sell this idea that your life will be better with this product. Not just, hey, this product will do what you need, but we're going to improve your life if you buy our product. And so that gets people to sort of really want to buy these things. The other thing is more and more credit purchase, buy now and pay later. And that probably sounds pretty familiar to y'all because that's how we do a lot of things. But back before this era, except for very expensive purchases like homes and land for farming and things, people didn't take out loans to buy stuff. If you didn't have the money to buy a car, you simply didn't buy a car. If you didn't have the money to buy a washing machine, you didn't buy a washing machine. You just saved up for it until you could. And that was how things were done. Now, though, in order to keep these sales going, it's almost like having a tiger by the tail here. In order to keep propelling these sales that they want, they begin to sell on credit. And American industry comes to depend on credit purchases for their continued growth. And that's fine until people stop paying their bills. Two things that are going to help influence this consumer culture are automobiles and Hollywood. The automobile is quite possibly the single most influential invention of the 20th century. The only thing that really even comes close is the personal computer, but that really doesn't become life-changing. Personal computers don't really become life-changing until the mid to late 1990s. The automobile is an entirely, for most of the century, it's a big thing. That really the three most influential inventions: automobiles, television, and computers. Just no doubt. Of the last century, no doubt those are the three most influential for America. By the 1920s, there's one car on the road for every 6 Americans. Henry Ford has realized his dream of making an automobile that virtually anybody with a decent job can afford, and that would be the Ford motor car. Highway construction, how is that going to affect things? Well, they're not very much good if they don't have roads. So you start seeing more and more roads being built. You see the people who bought the cars pressuring the government to build better roads and wider roads and things like that. And so they start doing that. Well, that's going to affect a lot of other industries, not just the automobile industry, which will sell more cars because there's better roads, but the construction industries and the materials industries for the construction, concrete and asphalt, all of those sorts of things. You see an entirely new kind of business open up, the gas station. You see new hotels. They call them motor hotels or motels, which are located along roadsides that are quick and easy to get into. They have doors on the outside, so it's not a big fancy place. It was a place designed literally for people to stop off on their way on a road trip, and people took vacations by car. Now they instead of the trains, this is going to hurt the railroad industry. So some industries are harmed by the automobile, some are helped by the automobile. Everybody is affected by the automobile. It even helps to increase the number of teen pregnancies, believe it or not, because when a young man had a car, he could pick up his girl and they would have a somewhat private place and the independence of motion that they'd never had before. And of course, that's going to lead to, a little bit of fooling around. And that leads to more babies. It's just that simple. Um, Hollywood is also going to help push this consumerism by giving people images of a wealthy, materialistic society as being a good thing. And, oh, look at the good life these people are living. Look at all the nice stuff they've got. They're driving fancy cars and wearing neat clothes and they just live a good life and they're just really, and Hollywood helps to portray that. And people see these things and start to want them more and more. And so that really helps to push this consumer culture as well. Um, a little bit about Hollywood. Hollywood, is in California. The first movies weren't made in California. They were made in New Jersey and New York area. Edison invented the motion picture camera, and he was based out of New Jersey, Menlo Park, New Jersey. And so that's where they made the first movies. But Southern California actually was a better place to make movies. First of all, there was no unions there to drive up the costs, but second of all, the weather was better. They had more sunny days, more warm days, so that when you were outdoors trying to shoot films, you didn't have to worry about freezing to death. Um, there was a variety of scenery, everything from beaches to forests to mountains to deserts, all within an hour or two drive of this area. And Hollywood, when they purchased the land there, it was basically the middle of nowhere, and so it was cheap to buy big chunks of land, which they wanted for these studios. One of the things that Hollywood portrayed was the image of the flapper, and she's sort of the iconic woman of the 1920s. These were women who wore typically wore much shorter dresses, came to about the knee. They drank and smoked publicly. They cut their hair short in non-traditional hairstyles. Basically, what these are is it's an image of the modern woman who's sort of rejecting the old roles somewhat. For women, they might work. They might be professionals. They certainly went out on dates and went dancing, and they did all of these things that were very challenging to the old traditional morals. And although it was really more of an image than a reality, not it took money to do all of this sort of thing. Uh, it still became something of an ideal again, an idea that would be very popular. So all of these financial good times and all of this growth and all of this purchasing on credit and everything, this is driving the economy up and up and up and up. And people are buying stocks and making money. And people were buying stocks who had never bought stocks before. I mean, janitors were buying stocks and street sweepers were buying stocks and things. And this was something that poor people had never done before, but they were buying these stocks, and they could afford to do so because somebody had come up with this idea called buying on margin, which basically means that you put a down payment down and you only pay for a portion of what you're actually buying. And the stockbroker loans you the rest of the money, um, until you sell it, and then he gets his money back first. So let's say that a stock cost $1 a share. You would pay 10 cents a share. The stockbroker would loan you 90 cents. Then when the stock went up, because all the stocks were going up, and I mean, that's pretty much true. I mean, stocks were just going crazy. Their prices were going up and up and up. So now then when the stock goes up and maybe it gets to $2 a share and you sell it, the first 90 cents goes to the stockbroker, right? Because he loans you that. Then he's going to take a cut for basically interest purposes. Okay, so he's going to take another maybe 20 cents out of that. So that's $1.10. And you're going to get 90 cents, but you only put down 10 cents. So you just made a lot of money for a 10-cent investment, right? Now, I'm just using simple round numbers to keep it easy to understand. But this happened a lot. It happened all the time. Okay. And they were speculating on what's called the bull market. That's that the market is going to continue to grow and improve. But there are some problems. All of this buying on credit, buying on margin, buying stocks on margins, buying on credit for these consumer goods and things. Personal debts are at a historical high as a result of that. Farming, construction, and a lot of industries were overproducing. They were continually producing more and more. We talked about why farmers were doing that. Their farm prices were down, so they would produce more in order to keep making the same amount of money, which has a nasty cycle of driving the prices down more. Construction, they're building too many houses. Industries were building too many things like washing machines and stuff. They're selling them on credit and cheaply and everything because they want to cash in while it looks good. Prices are going down, and they're creating a surplus of goods that's tying up capital. In other words, all of the money that was invested in making the washing machines was tied up in washing machines, and if they didn't get them sold, then they never get their money back out of it. And so all of these things are happening, and all of these things are going to help create the situation where the Great Depression will occur. Okay, and we see here the effects of the Great Depression on unemployment. That pink zone is the Great Depression highlights. And it was terrible unemployment. We're going to talk quite a bit more about the Great Depression and the government's response and the people's response to it in our next unit. But the next thing we have coming up is a test. And so it will be online. It will be online this week. And I will talk with y'all more about it on Discord and through the announcements and remind. So keep an eye on those things. And until then, we will talk to you later.